And we'll get going. So I just want to welcome everyone and just offer a couple logistical things. We are recording this webinar so that we can share it afterwards. And also for anyone who's looking for live closed captioning, you can enable that at the bottom of the Zoom window by clicking live transcript and then show subtitles. Feel free to message me in the chat if you have any issues with that. So just want to thank you for joining us for this Accessible Trails discussion, part 3, Funding Your Project with MassTrails. I'm Mariah Fogg, the Community Conservation Manager for the Berkshire Natural Resources Council, and I'm joined this afternoon by our presenters, Amanda Lewis, who's the MassTrails Director, Eli Velluti-Fry, the MassTrails RTP Manager, and Mackenzie Greer, the Director of Community Programs for Berkshire Natural Resources Council. And before passing the mic to our presenters, I just wanted to briefly share a little bit about how BNRC came to be hosting this particular discussion. So BNRC is a regional land trust actively working throughout Berkshire County in Western Massachusetts on land conservation, land stewardship, and community engagement. Back in 2018, we were thrilled to open an accessible trail. It was the first such trail that our organization had developed and built. And we had massive community support at the trail opening. There was a lot of attention from people both in the Berkshires and beyond. And you'll hear a little bit more about that particular trail later in the program. But skipping ahead a little bit, that trail remains a valuable community resource. And since then, we've built another accessible trail along the way and just had a few takeaways. The first is that we're still learning about accessible trails. We've understood or learning to understand that there's one piece that we wanted to share of just this deep need for more accessible woodland trails in our community and beyond. We've also learned that partnerships were essential in really helping to facilitate this continued learning. And we really feel we have a role to play in sharing our learning with our partners about these vital trails and just spreading the word. So this online sharing and learning program tonight is a direct result of these takeaways, and we're very grateful for our experts and for all of you who are here to learn along with us. Again, this evening's program is part 3 of a 3-part online learning opportunity. Part 1 took place last year, and it included a discussion about the importance of accessible trails and considerations for wayfinding and information sharing. Part 2 was earlier this year and focused on building, modification, and maintenance of accessible trails. And today we're going to hear about the MassTrails program and requirements for accessibility, some tips on complementary funding sources, challenges, and lessons learned from previous projects. We do have time at the end for some questions, and so please hold them until the end, or feel free to write them into the question and answer option instead of the chat as we go through the presentation. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Amanda.
Hi, I'm just gonna share my screen. Share. All right, there we go. Well, fortunately, the delivery truck came right before I unmuted, so that's great. You don't have to listen to my dog barking. Thanks so much for having us, to Mariah and Mackenzie. We appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar series and share some information about the MassTrails, and how it supports accessible trail projects. My name is Amanda Lewis. I am MassTrails Director out of the Department of Conservation and Recreation. I'm tasked with advancing the vision and the initiatives and goals of MassTrails team. Today, I'm joined by Eli Velluti-Fry, who will be speaking in a little bit, so he can also introduce his own self. And he is 1/3 of our team. He is our MassTrails RTP Recreational Trails Program Manager. And not with us today is Libby Knott, who from the names I'm seeing, I think I know a lot of you folks, but you probably know Libby also. She's the MassTrails Grants Program Manager. She's here with us in spirit, and we're all 3 of us available at any point in time after this presentation to talk through anything that you would like to discuss about MassTrails. So today we're here to talk about the MassTrails grant funding, as already indicated, but I just want to take a minute to talk briefly about what MassTrails actually is, and then I'll move on to a bit of an overview on the grant program and hand it over to Eli. So can everyone see me changing that? Okay, I'm unable to see my screen. Okay, so MassTrails, so back in 2017, the governor's office at the time formed something called the Interagency Trails Team, which consists of representatives of state agencies that plan, design, permit, construct, and maintain publicly accessible trails throughout the Commonwealth. There's only 3 agencies that do this. They include the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, MassDOT, and the Department of Conservation and Recreation. The group started meeting bi-weekly back then in 2017, and they continue to do so today. We actually have a meeting this coming Wednesday, and with the goal of building out the trail network in Massachusetts. So the Trails Team vision includes several core initiatives, one of which we're going to discuss in depth today, but there are also a few others to help accomplish our goals. One is that we work with other state and federal agencies, as well as stakeholders, to identify and tackle opportunities and barriers to getting trails built in Massachusetts. We do this through improved coordination, policies, and programs to support a common vision for trails. We also provide a public-facing platform for access to team-generated and outside technical resources and information through the MassTrails one-stop shop. I always have a hard time saying that. One-stop shop website. We can drop a link to that in the chat if that's possible, or you can just check out the end of this presentation where there is a link as well. The goal is to work not only internally as agencies, but also help our communities across the state to access appropriate guidance and information and funding resources to help them build out the trail network in Massachusetts as well. Finally, one of the other core initiatives of MassTrails team is to support the MassTrails grants program. The grants program was born from the need for more funding to fill gaps in the statewide trail network, and also the need to consolidate funding sources into one trails-focused grant application and management platform, which is available on our website and which is the MassTrails grant program. So MassTrails grants provide funds to plan, design, construct, and maintain recreational trails and shared use pathway projects across the Commonwealth. A lot of us call a shared use pathway maybe something different, but basically the funding runs the gamut of anything that you can define as a trail, and that includes what you might call a shared use pathway or a greenway, or perhaps a rail trail. We also fund water trails, or what some folks call paddling trails. We fund mountain bike trails, ski trails, trails that support motorized use, and of course hiking trails, and anything in between. The applications for the grant program are accepted annually. We only have one cycle each year, and the deadline is always February 1st, and will be this year in 2024. Eligible recipients are municipalities, nonprofit organizations, public entities, and Native nations. The award maximum depends on the project type and need, and is generally $100,000 for recreational trails projects, which are more local in nature, and $500,000 for shared use path projects, which are more regional in nature. So for the past few years, we've been able to fund up to $11 million in funds, which has allowed us to award approximately 60 to 80 projects. These are reimbursement grants, meaning that you must first spend the money up front. You must first spend the money and then apply for reimbursement through a series of documentation that we will guide you through if you were funded. These are also matching grants, which require a 20% match of the total project value. The really neat thing about this program is that you don't just match can be not only cash, but it can also be staff time, volunteer labor, and donations. So that's unique to this program, and it allows for some of our less resourced communities and nonprofits to find ways to get a project funded and provide match. So the MassTrails program is funded through two different funding sources. One is the Federal Recreational Trails Program, which has been around for a really long time. It's authorized through the U.S. Surface Transportation Act and has been since about 1994. We only have really good data until 2004, unfortunately. Before people were using computers to record data to keep track of their information. But we, at about $1 million per year, we have funded $24.5 million and 757 projects through the program since 2004. The guiding purpose of the legislatively for these funds is for projects which are recreational and get people out to experience different natural environments. These projects generally are relatively lower in cost based on what the project components are, but you can get you can achieve a certain amount of mileage with, even up to $50,000. That you can glean a lot of mileage from that. That's what I'm trying to say. The other funding source for the grant program are state capital dollars that were authorized through the Environmental Bond Bill in 2018 at the urging of the MassTrails team. And since then, we've been able to fund $29.5 million and 182 projects. The guiding purpose of these funds is to enhance the network of ADA accessible off-road bicycle pedestrian pathways for both recreational and transportation purposes, allowing people to get from where they live to where they work, learn, shop, and play. These projects are generally a lot more expensive. Shared use path project is often treated like a road in some ways and requires a lot of design, a lot of meticulous design, as well as a lot of regulatory hoops that you have to jump through. So these end up being a lot more expensive, which is why, nearly the same amount of funds has funded lesser projects. Really, a major benefit to these funds that was identified by the MassTrails team early on, and is why they were urging for these funds to be allocated, is that it allows for communities that can access the state transportation improvement funds through MassDOT for construction. Those are federal funds that can be allocated by MassDOT to communities for construction of trails. But in order to be able to access those funds, the communities have to pay for design themselves. So this funding allows us to fill the gap in these municipalities and community budgets to allow them to fill the gap in their networks by allowing them funding for design, engineering, and permitting that will then allow them to access the STIP funds for construction. Last year, or actually not last year, this past spring, we awarded our latest round of grants, which was, we were able to award $11.4 million to 70 projects, which directly benefited 78 communities, 51 environmental justice communities, and 11 gateway cities. This is a map of those awards with an overlay of the environmental justice layer. And I like this as a demonstration of how we try to geographically disperse our grant funding and allow for us to reach all corners of Massachusetts through this program. So what kind of funds what kind of projects do we fund? What project activities? I'll go through these rather quickly, but we do fund design, engineering, and permitting. We recently have funded Groundwork Lawrence for the Merrimack Riverwalk pathway in Lawrence. This was awarded for design. And at our recent event for the announcement of the Trails grants this year, we were in Billerica, where we also funded a project for design of the Yankee Doodle pathway. We fund the construction of new trails, rather self-explanatory. The maintenance and restoration of existing trails. This can vary from anything to resurfacing a paved surface to redecking a bridge, or installing water bars along a hiking trail. We also fund the acquisition of easements and fee interest in properties for trails and trail corridors. So we have funded the acquisition of rail corridor for then to be created a rail trail. And we also fund, lesser known, the purchase of parcels of land which may be able to provide a critical connection of a trail system, like the New England National Scenic Trail or the Mass Central Rail Trail. We fund the development and rehabilitation of trailside and trailhead facilities. This can run from anything from an interpretive panel to kiosks to parking lots. Shelters, we funded a couple of shelters recently, viewing platforms, and of course, wayfinding signage along trail systems. We do fund maps and brochures, as long as they are directly related to the trail and don't have a lot of other information that's unrelated on them. And the rental or purchase of trail construction and maintenance equipment. We have funded a lot of snow grooming machines. We fund lawnmowers, and we can fund other equipment that allows, some of our communities who are stewarding our trails can be elderly, and they're still getting out there and maintaining the trails, but they're also in need of help in getting materials to and from where they're doing their work. So we have funded several different projects where they provide that mechanism to get the materials in and out. So I'd save this for last. Project development and feasibility studies are a permissible use of funds under the grant program. I just wanted to note, given the audience today, that these types of projects that we're looking to fund under feasibility studies are usually very complex in nature and require a lot of upfront investigation as to whether the project is feasible because of their complexity. So, for example, we've funded the feasibility assessment of the Dorchester Greenway, which is a proposed trail above a train line tunnel. And there's obviously a lot that goes into that, and we were excited to fund the feasibility of that possible trail in an environmental justice community. We also funded a little while back the town of Sandwich. Basically, there's a gap in the network on the Cape Cod Rail Trail that runs between Barnstable and the canal in Sandwich, and we funded. This is a complex route that needed a lot of investigation, and in order to determine what the best route would be to get to make this connection. So these are the types of feasibility studies and project development that we do fund. On the other hand, we also fund trail assessments, which I think more pertain to your natural surface trail type projects. Assessments are when you hire somebody or a group gets paid to go out and take a look at the trail system and see what improvements need to be made, so that you can make a plan for what kind of work you'll be needing to fund in the future. The program does fund this, and I'm thinking especially in the cases where you may have a relatively flat trail in your community, in your forest, and you're looking to maybe upgrade that to an accessible trail. We would fund an assessment that would look into whether or not that would be possible. So briefly, MassTrails seeks projects that provide connectivity, equity, accessibility, efficient use of funds, that are ready for the proposed phase, incorporate safety, and have a high experiential value. These are all kind of expected criteria that one would encounter in a grant program. And I just wanted to highlight those that are especially prioritized within our program. Equity is very important to the grant program, and we do look for applicants to express how they are serving an underserved population, whether it be intersection within environmental justice community or other communities where there is need, including the idea of having a trail near an elderly population, or near a hospital or rehabilitation facility, for example. We do have a great trail that is next door, that DCR built a while back, that is next door to the Perkins School for the Blind. So we do look for this intersection where we are serving underserved communities and allowing them to access the trails. We also, as mentioned before, look to geographically disperse our grants where, whenever possible, we try to reach all corners of Massachusetts. So although rural communities have smaller populations, we recognize that they need trails too, and we'd like to get our funding out to those communities as well. We encourage Youth Corps to be a part of any project. Obviously, we want to engage with and educate our next generation of stewards and advocates and trail builders, hopefully, because our trail community isn't getting any younger, and we need to get our youth involved. So if you can involve youth in your project, we highly encourage it. And then we also highly encourage, as a priority within our grant program, accessible trails, and applying for projects that would incorporate accessible trails components, or the entire project being an accessible trail. I'm going to hand it over to Eli now so that he can talk a little bit more about this specific priority and how you as listeners can allow for your project to be a priority for our program, but also to understand how we review and score, and how we look to fund these types of projects. Sorry, I rambled there for a second, but over to you, Eli.
Thank you, Amanda. Next slide. My name is Eli Velluti-Fry, and I am the Recreational Trails Program Manager with MassTrails. So that means that I am tasked with overseeing the RTP funding side of our program. So the way that MassTrails makes accessibility one of our top priorities, as Amanda highlighted a few slides ago, it is part of our scoring rubric. Specifically, its own area on our scoring rubric is accessibility. We highlight in all of our guidance for our applicants. There is even a accessibility guidance document specific to our application. Accessibility is also, as Amanda mentioned, included in a few of our other priorities, including equity. So it can impact scores in both the accessibility section as well as the equity section. We recognize a growing number of voices are calling attention to the need for more accessible trails throughout the state and across the country. In 2023, we were able to fund $9.6 million in engineering, design, permitting, and construction of accessible shared use paths and recreational trails. So that is 81% of the funding for this year went to accessible trails projects throughout the state. However, we still would like to increase that number if possible. And we recognize also that accessible paths and woodland trails can be particularly a higher financial investment. And in response to that, we have increased our RTP funding to $100K per project. I think I saw that question come up. So that is $100K per project for those recreational trails program. So you're talking the natural surface woodland trails typically are on that side. We are hoping that increasing that will increase the number of high quality accessible projects that we are able to fund in 2024, as well as future years. Next slide. All right, so accessibility requirements for MassTrails. On our shared use path side, the U.S. Access Board actually just in August published their final rule for the accessibility guidelines for pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way, otherwise known as PRO-WAG. They had published the guidance in draft form in 2013, and they published the final rule 10 years later. And we are very happy about that. We're happy to have some real established guidance to give to folks to make their shared use paths as highly accessible as possible. On the recreational trails program side, we use the Forest Service Trail Accessibility Guidelines. I'm not going to get super into this because I know that this was discussed in depth in a previous webinar that I was on, and suggest all of you check out for planning your projects. That's a really highly informative. So the only thing with FSTAG that I do want to highlight is FSTAG is specific to hiker pedestrian trails. And with that, they do allow for exceptions to the technical requirement based on specific project needs. The RTP funds a variety of diverse projects, so we do allow for the funding of projects that do not fit all of the technical requirements of FSTAG, but grantees are expected and must adhere as much as they can to those technical requirements. And we go through an entire section in the application that highlights the FSTAG, goes through everything, and the areas where you are seeking an exception, you must document and explain why you can't make that technically within FSTAG guidance. Additionally, we do continue to prioritize accessibility for applications that are not just woodland paths. So as Amanda mentioned, we fund a variety of projects, including motorized, equestrian, and blue trails. Equestrian, one thing that I would love to see an application for is more equestrian trails. Specifically, they have mounting ramps to help folks be able to get up a ramp instead of having to climb on top of that horse. So there's definitely accessibility opportunities for equestrian trails. For blue trails, there's this this photo here that we have was in Athol. It's a project we funded in Athol. You can see, I've got a slide next in a second that I can really explain how this docking system works, but that is an easy dock system. And we funded both the acquiring of that dock system as well. In the ribbon cutting photo down there in the corner, you can see that we also funded the approach from the parking lot. I didn't post a picture of the parking lot. We funded the parking lot too. But from the parking lot all the way to the approach to the ramp, all of that was partially funded by MassTrails funding. And Amanda, if you want to go to the next slide. And these docks are particularly cool because as you can see, there's actually a seat where people can sit down, and this goes out over top of your kayak, and you're able to load into your kayak much easier. And there are also bars here for you to have something to hold on to, and then you can roll off those rollers into the water. So this is a nice way for folks to be able to easily get into and launch their kayaks and be able to access those water trails. When reviewing for accessibility for the applications, as I said, we have a lot of guidance documents that really highlight really what we're asking for throughout all the project parts, including accessibility. Specifically with accessibility, as I mentioned, we are looking to see that you are adhering to the technical requirements of FSTAG or ProWAG. We are also looking for that equity piece. So if you are able to, in your application, explain how your project serves a greater diversity of residents of Massachusetts, that will increase your scoring on that equity. So creating an accessible trail would be serving a greater diversity of residents of Massachusetts. Also, experiential is very important. We want folks to actually be able to get out and enjoy the outdoors when they're on these trails. Here is a photo of the Doyle Accessible Trail Loop that is at Trustees of Reservations property in Leominster. Since we funded this initial red loop, they have actually expanded the loop to the other side, and it is now 1.5 miles. I think this is a really good explanation of what a good experiential trail looks like. You can see from those topographic lines that it actually changes grade a little bit, goes up and down. It has both an upper meadow with a hilltop viewing area, as well as pond view and a boardwalk. So it has an array of environmental systems that folks can see while they're on that trail. Some challenges that we have experienced both as a grant program as well as from grantees is really education is a big one. Folks don't realize that they really need to be considering accessibility from the start. They need to make sure that they have an understanding of how to assess their project for accessibility, as well as making sure that things are properly designed, and when building the trail that you continue to follow those specifications. So there's a lot of steps in there, and you really need to start early and make sure that you're thinking about all of this first thing. This has to be at the start of your project planning. Another big impact are regulatory requirements, which goes to our budget section. As I mentioned, one of the reasons for our increase to 100,000 is because the budget specifically for accessible trails projects can be higher. There are often impacts to wetlands that you have to consider, including just making sure that you have the funding to do the wetlands work that needs to be done before you can even do the project. Archaeology specifically for our projects becomes something to overcome because of archaeological resources beneath the ground and are not wanting to impact those, obviously. A lot of our projects, we wind up having to build above ground. Now, for a lot of all persons trails, as most of you know who were on that previous webinar, most trails, you dig a little bit out of the earth, and so you have a space to put that nice hard aggregate so that you get the firm and stable surface of the trail system. If we are forcing you to build above ground as part of a requirement to receive grant funding, you have to make sure that you have designed differently than being able to dig. So that is just something to keep in mind, especially if you are aware or have an idea that you are in an archaeologically sensitive area, you will likely need to build that trail above ground. Speaking of aggregate costs change. FSTAG simply requires that the treadway be firm and stable. And we get applications occasionally that say, well, it's firm and stable half the year. That doesn't count, unfortunately, because we need that accessibility component to be year round. So if it gets muddy, if it gets washed out, that is no longer going to be appropriate. And so aggregate is really important to create that firm and stable surface year round. So keeping in mind what aggregate costs are going to be, shipping from that, adding that portion to the budget can get hefty, and it's something to keep in mind ahead of time. Also, labor costs. These are labor-intensive projects. Labor costs, if you look at this past year, it rained so much that slowed down a lot of people's trail seasons just because of the ability to be out in the woods. So making sure you keep that in mind when you are scoping out the timeline for this project, as well as how much labor will be put into the project. And finally, maintenance. Maintenance has been mentioned a couple of times. It's a big one. This photo on the right, you can see there's a nice aggregate. It's very great, flush to the ground, wonderfully packed, very firm and stable. Those rains this summer got to them. They couldn't keep up with it, and that is no longer an accessible trail. You can't walk through that. You can't get through that without getting hit by at least 20 ticks. That was near the Berkshire, so 20 ticks. So maintenance is a very important thing to include when you are considering these projects. Which brings me to tips for accessible project applications. Look at this beautifully maintained trail at Thomas and Palmer Brook, the BNRC property. So anyway, gorgeous trail, wonderfully maintained. They make sure that this gets mowed frequently enough to keep all that vegetation back. So that's a little bit lower down, but including a maintenance plan when you are applying and showing us that that is part of your plan going forward. Like I said, we expect these trails to remain accessible. We are funding an accessible project. We expect it to maintain accessibility, so maintenance is key. On your application, please clearly indicate how your project meets and exceeds accessibility standards. Like I said, we do have that section with the checklist, which really helps you to guide you to highlight that very easily. Please fill that trail accessibility section out completely and accurately and fully. In your application, also take the time to highlight how this gap might fill some critical needs within this trail system currently. Is this the only accessible trail system in the town or the county or the whole region? Highlight that, make sure we are aware of that up front. As I mentioned, maintenance plan, super important, so we know that this will maintain accessibility going forward. And in addition to keeping that maintenance up on the vegetation, that also means occasionally coming in with more aggregate and refilling those spots that might have gotten low or washed out because of some small design failure. These things happen. Climate change is impacting how much rain we're getting. You have to be prepared for it. Community outreach. Make sure you're talking to the community. Have you actually spoken to the folks in your community that are disabled and want this trail and need this trail? Speak to them, find out what their needs are, what they actually want, have them be an engaged part of the process. And potentially most importantly, really high up there, like I said, experience. We want these trails to be offering something to folks that they need. Folks need these things, and having an experience where they're actually able to get out and experience something. A longer trail is really good. We want to stay away from creating accessible trails for the sake of just saying that you have a trail that doesn't actually bring about the woodland benefits that folks seek from nature. So make sure that you are highlighting that experience on that project. So some examples from our 2023 season. Greenagers is building a half-mile accessible trail up in Dalton. Greenagers is a youth course, so they are also including the youth component for our priorities. And it also will have an accessibly built platform and fishing space at the end of that trail. So that adds, one, it goes through the woods, that's nice, but also has that added experience of being able to do some wildlife viewing or do a little bit of fishing out at the end of that trail. And in Worcester at the Ecotarium, they currently have this really popular trail system. We are funding this year the design, engineering, and permitting to be able to turn that system into an accessible trail for folks who are actually going to the Ecotarium. Getting away from the accessibility component a little bit, just straight up how to apply for our program. Amanda went through this a little bit. Here are the links, which we will be sending BNRC folks this, so we'll be able to get that out to you. First of all, November 1st is when the application opens. It's going to be available right at that website. Make sure you're reading through all of the grant guidelines and application before you even really get going into the application itself. You can download the application template and the budget timeline and worksheet and fill it out ahead of time so that when you actually go to fill out the online form and submit it, you've got your answers. You can just copy and paste them. If you are not the landowner or if there is a conservation restriction on the property, please get the landowner permission forms as well as the conservation restriction work authorization form. Those forms are all available on that website. You're going to want to have those at the time that you actually submit your application. They are a requirement. Make sure you have all of your project maps and specifications, anything that you really want to highlight. We do require 2 different types of maps. That is spelled out in the application itself, what we're looking for from those maps. When you have all of these things together and ready to go, that's when you go on the application. Like I said, you can copy and paste directly into that template, making sure you have everything that you need and submit the full application to us. Some more general tips, which are we've highlighted most of these throughout. One, as I've indicated, these projects require a decent amount of effort before you even apply. Do not wait till January. You will not have enough time to get the things that you need if you wait till January. Like I said, landowner documentation, that all is required up front. We have a decent amount of guidance online. Essentially everything is there. And Amanda and Livy and I are also like pretty responsive to questions. So you can reach out if you're really confused and let us know what's going on. We're happy to walk you through things as needed. When you do fill out things, please answer each question directly. Do not reference document 3C in paragraph B. Just say what the answer is. And also please say it in a complete sentence. Visuals are super important. We don't do site visits before we look at these applications and score them. So making sure that you're including photos. Like I said, we have a 2-map requirement, but if you have more maps, feel free to use them. We do have a 25 megabyte upload limit. So please just make sure you are compressing those photos and specifications so that they all fit in the application when you submit it. This is a list of some other grant funding resources. These are all also listed on our website. Specifically for this crowd, the Fields Pond Foundation is going to be a really great grant resource for folks to check out. The other ones are also great to look into, see what they have as an option. The Community Preservation Act, if your town has that and takes part in that, that is also an interesting way to go and an option for you. But I'm specifically highlighting the Fields Pond Foundation as a great one for folks in this crowd. And as I said, our grant application opens November 1st. Applications are due February 1st. So again, do not wait until January. We will be having an information session on Wednesday, November 5th. And there's some more contact information there on that last slide for you. And thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Amanda and Eli. We really appreciate you going through all that information, and we'll absolutely be sharing those resources with folks in a follow-up email. So now we're going to pass it over to Mackenzie to talk through a project and BNRC's experience utilizing some of these funds and some lessons learned.
Great. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to set my screen. Can you see when I move the cursor?
I can, yes.
You can. Okay, great. Thanks. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. It's exciting to see how well attended these sessions have been on accessible trails and the wide range of folks who are participating. Big thanks to Amanda and Eli for sharing a really important program that we have available to us in Massachusetts. It's been incredibly essential for BNRC, Berkshire Natural Resources Council, in advancing many different types of trail programs or projects, excuse me, to rely on MassTrails. So today, I'm going to share a little bit about our land trust very briefly, but more importantly, a particular project that I worked on, that I was the project manager for. I'd been involved in the conservation end of it, and helped advance it into trail construction. So we'll just share an overview of the project itself, the funding plan that we developed, how we achieved project readiness, how we sometimes took 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and what we learned from that. Those challenges are some of the most important parts of our projects, and how this particular project prepared us for subsequent accessible trail projects as well. So BNRC, Berkshire Natural Resources Council, is a regional land trust. So we work throughout the 32 communities in Berkshire County, the westernmost county of the state. We steward over 26,000 acres of conservation land. About half of that is in land that we hold and steward in fee. So we are primarily responsible for opening that to the public on lots of reserves. We have trail systems, we have places to park, we have ways for people to explore in a guided way, but also people are welcome to walk off trail as well. Knowing how much people prefer to be on trail and looking at our county and the population that we have a very high percentage of folks with disabilities. We have our average age is older than the statewide average. In part, that's driven by a lot of retirees who live in the Berkshires. And over time, it became clear to us that accessible trails were kind of a new and exciting and really important, crucial expansion of the ways that we could invite people to enjoy the outdoors and our reserves. So we right now have really just a couple of accessible trails. Meanwhile, we're really building our ability to have additional ones in the future and support other accessible trails around us. So let's see, I was supposed to start a timer, so I had some sense of how long I was talking. I'm going to talk about a project called the Parsons Marsh Accessible Trail today. Let's see if I can get this to advance. There we go. Okay, so I want to just give you a quick overview of the conservation project itself, because that does impact the way we develop the funding plan and a number of things that followed. So this was a really complicated conservation project. What conservation project isn't complicated? This one in particular, though, used just about every kind of conservation tool that we use as practitioners. We had one conservation restriction that included a rather complicated trail easement. We had 2 different fee purchases at different times. We had 1 fee donation. We were working with the town that had received by donation land to the south as well. This whole area, and I neglected to include a locus map, but it's in a very scenic community, the town of Lenox, right in the center of Berkshire County. This particular route is a very iconic one. There's a great view across toward this marsh, Parsons Marsh, and it had forever sort of been this gorgeous view that no one knew how to access, that people were interested in, but was kind of off limits. So we worked with the landowners of a farm called Undermountain Farm, who were interested in conserving this land. They were kind of planning their estate and their next stages, and really wanted to see this important landscape conserved. So we worked with them to place a conservation restriction and to purchase a portion of their land. We were able to purchase some adjacent land as well. And then in order to do that, though, because of all of these complicated pieces and really high value conservation land, we had a huge bargain sale from the donors, from the landowners, but we did have to also employ a variety of other sources. We had a focus campaign in the neighborhood and the area around this particular landscape. So we asked for private donations. We received those landowners went through the conservation land tax credit program. We reached out to multiple foundations, so we had a lot of different sources of funds coming in. A little bit later in the process, we used what was called then Housatonic River Natural Resources Damages Fund. This is a tributary, or this is the water from Parsons Marsh flows into the Housatonic River, which was damaged by PCBs, and there's a pool of funds that we're able to use to acquire conservation land in support of the protection of that river. Because of all of this, we really felt like the CPA, the Community Preservation Act in this town, was going to be a great source of funds. It ended up being incredibly complicated to pursue funds for the conservation project. I won't get into the details here, but it created a lot of real challenge between our organization and the town, folks who were really trying to help us get it done, but it just wasn't a good fit. We had to scrap that, and really that's when the community and neighborhood campaign came into play. We were able to do all of the conservation work. This area is about 500 acres of conserved land, comprised in a real mosaic of ownership and strategies and funding types. Because of this sort of process that we were embedded in, we felt a real urgency to create public access here. We had been so public with this project, one of the most public projects we had ever done, because of these sort of challenging landowner and town relations. We really felt like there needed to be a win, like a really positive, tangible outcome for everyone. We wanted to show the public benefit as well of conserving these lands. We had quite a few people who would call it the swamp. And it sort of had this negative connotation. And we wanted people to be able to come in and experience this really beautiful, really important type of landscape. And so really helping people understand the wetland function, the rich habitat, the important complex of lands that was really throughout this area, but could be shown just in this one short trail system. We also knew it needed to be great. Like, it needed to be one of the best trails we'd ever done because of all of these past challenges. But the cost was high. And so we also needed to say, hey, we can do a gorgeous trail. It is going to cost a lot of money, but we can do something really exceptional. So let's see, moving on. I just want to walk you through what that trail looked like. It is about a third mile long one way. So it's not a very long trail, but had a really big impact. This was built to be FSTAG compliant. As Eli was sharing earlier, the Forest Service trail accessibility guidelines, this followed those. We did not need exceptions, thankfully. And this is a very gentle graded, but with a great variety of experiences along the trail. The beginning starts with an accessible parking area. That's really important and something that you need to really plan for and be able to fund. It is more expensive to do an accessible parking lot, and it needs to be continually maintained. That grade is really important. So as you come in, we use some boulders to help keep a sense of openness as you came in, but also ensure that motorized vehicles were not going down the path. This was a really nice kiosk that we had built by Timber Homes in Vermont. We also designed the kiosk to be FSTAG compliant. So someone who is in a mobility device can pull up here, can view the information, and it had some particular just details, there's a mat here that is actually a plastic core recycled material that helps keep that area flat. That was donated by a company that was starting to work in this area. The kiosk has all of the same information that we have on our regular kiosks, great property information, trail description. At the bottom, it also has a very specific description of the trail route. Particularly for someone who is using a mobility device, this is incredibly important to share the grade, the cross slope, the very specific, detailed, technical information. It feels a little dry. We sort of struggled with it as we prepared the kiosk. That information is really important for someone who needs it. If you don't need it, you might not even sort of register what it is you're reading. The trail then transitions to that type of graded trail, compacted gravel. It's a mix of multiple types of gravel that really come together and form an incredibly compact surface. We're lucky to have a quarry in the Berkshires who makes this material, and really it's terrific stuff. So we're able to keep those edges clear with mowing, and we haven't had, to my knowledge, we haven't had to resurface this one. From here, the trail meanders, and there is a spur off to a pond. So we were lucky to have this really beautiful additional feature at this property. We have an accessible picnic table. So that was our first one, and it's really a special gathering place, as well as a bench. And then we kept the dock in place. So that is all an accessible area as well. From there, if you don't take the spur, but you continue down, you start to pass into the wetter area. We have a stream crossing here, bridge over that stream crossing. There's 2 more bridges. The bridges transition into a boardwalk. That boardwalk, here's just one example picture. It includes multiple bump outs, so a space for 2 wheelchairs to be able to pass. That's an important feature and is part of those FSTAG guidelines. And the whole trail culminates in an observation platform. So it was a 10 by 10 platform. Every time I go, there is a really interesting gathering of people at the end of that who clearly didn't know each other before they arrived there, and just these wonderful conversations happen. And that is just a really lovely contemplative space, and also a place we like to bring birding groups and others. We did include benches. You can't really see them here because they weren't there yet. We added our benches later. And in part, it was just driven by the timing and the design development. We also just kind of wanted to sit with it for a moment and see how people used it and see where they were best placed. So you can see these benches were added later in a very sensitive way, space for a wheelchair or mobility device to also come up along the side of it. So just to give you a sense of the project readiness, which is a focus of this session here, we really started in 2015 and 16 with the conservation process. While that was all going on, we were scouting for the trail location again and again and again. We used our winter time as much as possible because this was such a wet area. We needed that frozen ground. That was really important for us to be able to get into these spaces. We did a lot of contextual review, and some of this had happened before during the construction period, but we wanted to really understand the trail, how the trail was envisioned by the town. There was a good amount of sort of community plans that had been prepared and accepted within the town, so that was really helpful. The open space and recreation plan is huge, so you want to see if your town has an open space and recreation plan. Look for any mention of the type of resource that you want to do, or look at what kinds of opportunities is this town looking to create for folks to get outside. So this was both supported because it was a trail into the marsh. Wetlands were a clearly identified resource that folks wanted public access to, and it was intended to be an accessible trail. And so both of those things were high priorities. They were mentioned in the town's open space and recreation plan, as well as in much more detail in the sorry, I think I spoke wrong, but the town's master plan and the open space and recreation plan. So we were able to call a lot of that forward. We also applied for Community Preservation Act funding, and there was a good synergy with what the Community Preservation Fund plan laid out as well. So all of those plans showed that this was all in sync. So the trail route did change during the conservation process. We received a donation of land that really created a lot of opportunity for a much more interesting trail. It's the piece of property that had the pond on it. It was a little higher and drier for longer, and so we didn't have to do as much boardwalk. So it was really planned around the most interesting features of the property. The stewardship manager and trail coordinator had quickly realized that there was potential for an accessible trail. And so really from the beginning, we were thinking this was going to be an accessible trail. Really elevations were the key piece here. We didn't have to really address huge changes in grade. There were some, but they were manageable. Another opportunity we had was that a man named Peter Jensen, he's was featured in our previous accessible trail session. He is a renowned trail designer and builder. He started to specialize in accessible trails. And so we pulled Peter into this really early and said, we need you to help us figure this out. He loved the space and was really smitten by it and was excited to help us plan this trail. Going through the conservation process really helped us better understand the town's needs and desires and really work through that in depth. So we were relying on some of that outreach process. There is a local land trust as well, the Lennox Land Trust. They were instrumental in all of this process. So excited by the trail. They would help us. We scheduled walks and times when people could come and get a sense of what would this trail look like? What is it going to do in terms of accessibility? Really getting people out on the ground frequently. And it was a time of crossover a little bit with the conservation process and the trail. And so it was really exciting. So from the conceptual review, Peter's plan gave us the cost estimates, let us understand how much we needed to fundraise for, and we developed a funding plan that I'm going to talk about more. Then we were able to move into trail development. So we actually submitted our trail applications at the end of 2016 and early 2017. And then we worked throughout 2017 on the trail plan and development. We could have taken a path, what Amanda and Eli were describing, of applying for planning funding and then going into construction. It just happened that we were sort of too far along here. And so we did all of the planning ourselves and fundraised for that. The design development was pretty intensive. We had some changes that we needed to account for. We also, permitting is expensive. This was in a wetland, and we were putting a boardwalk in the middle of a wetland. So we really had to work through the permitting process. We were lucky here that we had the trail designer worked really well with the wetland scientist who arranged all of the permitting for us. The wetland specialist knew trails really well. She had worked on a lot of these projects before and was really passionate about it. And she was also the gold standard for conservation commissions. So they knew if she was bringing something forward, it was solid. And this was really important because there were some places where there were challenges between the accessibility standards and what was required by the Conservation Commission to protect the wetland. And so we really had to hash some things out that hadn't really ever been hashed out before in this way. And so we had really great experts helping us, and we had a town that wanted to see this happen as well. So then we were able to move into construction, and we did it basically all within the primary construction, all within one season, one long season. So just to go back to the funding plan a little bit, what was then Recreational Trails Program, RTP, now called MassTrails, I'll call it MassTrails from now on, funded it at the $75,000 level. I was trying to remember, I think 50 was actually the base cap at that time, but 75 if it was met certain criteria, and this one did. I think that's what it was, or it was maybe the 60,000, and we were able to get it up to the 75. So that was really helpful to match with a huge CPA grant of $235,000 from the town. The town really stepped up here, and it was a challenge to get the town to come in at that level, but people really understood how much was involved here. These two sources of funds worked really well together, and we've used them since, and I encourage folks to really look at pairing these sources of funds if your town has CPA funding. The funding priorities have some similarity. They, depending on how CPA in your town is laid out, an accessible trail can be a really good type of project under the recreation, open space and recreation piece of CPA. And again, this was supported by community plans. So we had this really nice synergy that MassTrails wanted to see and was already in place, saying, this town really wants this type of project. We didn't have to do all of that. That wasn't such a heavy lift to prove the community wants to see this. We used one grant to leverage the other, and we were very transparent about that, and that's okay. So, the MassTrails knew we were applying for CPA, CPA knew we were applying, and when we had good news about the other, we shared it. And so they both kind of came and were finalized around the same time, which was really neat. The timing for the construction and the span, I think most CPA funds give you a 2-year time frame, which MassTrails did as well. And so we had some good flexibility where we still needed to do a lot of in-depth permitting work in that first year, and then the next year was construction. And so overall, just the requirements were very similar at that time. Again, it was a few years ago, but not a whole lot has changed to my knowledge, and we've done a few more of these. As well, we used contractors, so for the parking lot and for the trail construction. That did help us with the administration of these grants, because we essentially had kind of singular bills coming in that we were requesting that we would pay and then request reimbursement for. So some of the challenges that we faced in this, we did have a huge design change. Eli mentioned this. We, as a result of applying for MassTrails, we submitted our project notification form to the Mass Historic Commission. We received a response saying there's enough of a likelihood of pre-settlement, pre-colonial settlement remains because of the type of landscape it was. There was a likelihood that Indigenous people who lived in this area were likely to have used this landscape. So we had to sort of go back. We were able to keep the design the same within the meadow, which had been highly disturbed from farming practices. So it was really, as we got more into the wetland area, we had to switch to an at-grade design. The design ended up being better. It truly was. We protected the resource in the way that we ought to be protecting it, and it worked out. But it was a little a little concerning there for a while. It was a big sort of change, and we ought to have done that that project notification form much earlier. That's how we would have known, and this would have been flagged. I mentioned this before, the standards for FSTAG compliant trails and the protections for wetland resources differ. This had to do with spacing of boardwalks. So for FSTAG, they didn't want the spacing to be over an inch. Yet the Conservation Commission wanted the spacing to be an inch or more to allow for more light infiltration into the wetland to ensure that the vegetation could thrive. We really had to work with them, and we came to a compromise. I think it was on one end, it was 1/2 an inch was the desired for FSTAG compliance, but up, just not to exceed an inch. We ended up kind of meeting in the middle. So it was like gaps of not more than 3/4 of an inch in spacing. Again, we had a really good designer that was trusted, and we were able to work through a lot of this. That designer and wetland permitting specialists were really helpful. The design contractor also bid on construction. So we put out an RFP to multiple contractors. We knew we were submitting to the same contractor as designed, but we wanted to ensure a fair process. And so we consulted with Amanda to make sure that what we were laying out was in compliance with MassTrails, but also to understand what are some of the best practices. We really hadn't gone through that kind of process before. We did a really careful evaluation to make sure that we were treating the proposals fairly. And so we were able to award it to the designer. So it was both the best proposal and ended up being the most cost effective. Throughout this, we learned a big lesson, and this is not the case with every grant program, but for MassTrails and for these particular projects, these grant staff are really there to help support your project. They're a really great resource. They've been, if you're having an issue, chances are someone else has, or probably at least 6 other projects have had this issue. Trust them, reach out to them, and don't be afraid to share your issues and request help. They helped us a lot and work through some issues and still have a great project. Let's see. Good, timing's good. The Parsons Marsh Accessible Trail also really created the foundation for us for another whole accessible trail from the beginning that we created. And that was more CPA funding, but then MassTrails came in and funded the development of additional trail systems off of that accessible trail. And so it was that expansion of the network. People were wanting more. They were wanting to explore more of that property. It really helped deepen our learning of what it was going to take to build and maintain these trails. We learned a ton. We learned a ton from the accessibility community. We learned a lot from the process. At the same time, we took on the stewardship of an accessible trail that had been built 10 years earlier and required deep maintenance and retrofitting to gain accessibility status back. And we're actually still working on that right now. Again, with help from MassTrails, we just have the parking lot to build up to standard. And we did a ton of work there that ultimately will help reduce our maintenance burden somewhat, but it's a forever game. It truly is. But what was so great was that it really just, for us, like centered this experience in a desire and calling to enhance the outdoor experience for everyone. We had some really special moments from folks who really needed the accessible trail in order to get out and experience nature. And it's some of the most powerful moments I've had in my work at BNRC. And it really has brought great exposure for our organization. These properties with accessible trails are the top 3 or 4 visited reserves that we have across the board consistently. They're short trails though, so they turn over a lot. So the parking lots don't fill up, aren't constantly full, but they have a lot of traffic through them and people deeply appreciate them. So I think that concludes. Oh, I did want to just point out, this was one project at the bottom here that you can see this bench. This was the trail that we sort of took on stewardship of. The accessible portion just kind of petered out. It just like ended and didn't bring people anywhere. And we just thought, gosh, this is something we've really got to address. And so we had the opportunity to open up the end, to smooth it out, and to create a really gorgeous landing. This is on the east branch of the Housatonic River, a clean section of the river, and provide a beautiful bench and space for people to really arrive somewhere. And that experience of arriving, of being in nature, of having a place to be, really change what was already a really wonderful experience to just something highly elevated. And then, Eli, thank you. You showed Thomas and Palmer already, but here's another picture of that woodland trail at our Thomas and Palmer Reserve. And Mariah, our host today, took the lead on creating an accessible trail brochure. So Berkshire County Trails for All, it's called. I think she's going to pop that into the chat, where we feature some of our trails, but also other accessible trails around the Berkshires, again, with some very specific descriptors, because we heard people clamoring for this information. As soon as we built one, people said, well, where are the rest of these trails? Can we have more of them? So this kind of funding is really essential. So thank you. Appreciate everyone's time, and hope we'll still have a few minutes for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mackenzie. I just popped both of the English language and Spanish language brochures into the chat. And we do have a decent amount of time for questions. I would recommend that if you want to ask your question on your own, you can just use the raise hand function, and I can unmute you and allow you to do that yourself, or you can input it into the chat or the Q&A. We're pretty flexible here. But to get us going, I saw a question come into the chat from Steph Hess, and they asked, 100,000, is it max per project or per year?
So that would be per project for the recreational trails projects that we're looking at.
Great. Thank you, Amanda.
And there's actually another question about time frame. And it's a little bit nuanced, but the state funds are fiscal year dependent. So projects funded under that source tend to, for the most part, be required to be finished in a year, from July 1st to June 30th of the next year. But the recreational trails program dollars are actually multi-year grants. So you have multiple years to complete. Usually contracting would begin around now if you were awarded funds from the previous cycle of due February 1st this year. And then you would have 2 years plus a few months until December 31st to complete your project.
Great, thank you. It looks like Anna has a question. RFP requirements, any chance you can share the document so that I can ensure our RFP is complete?
I'm sorry, is that in the chat?
Yes, yep, in the webinar chat.
Amanda, is that something that you have a list of requirements? I could share what we had put out for Parsons Marsh, but now that's a few years old. So I don't want to give anyone sort of the wrong information.
Yeah, so generally, an example would be very helpful to folks, especially since this question is being asked. But we don't necessarily review RFPs before they go out. We have grant requirements in terms of, your regulatory compliance and your work continuing to be consistent with the scope that was proposed and the budget that was proposed. But we don't get into the weeds with grantees when it comes to RFPs, and we have no required document that you have to fill out as a part of your RFP process. We do need you to keep track of the bidders that you receive, the bids that you receive.
Great, thank you. We do have some questions in the chat. What would be an example of an above ground trail, like a boardwalk? Question mark.
Eli, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so a boardwalk would be one option to do. What we typically see happen is, I was talking about how a lot of times we want to use that stone dust aggregate to give yourself a nice firm and stable surface for the treadway. So a lot of times that is dug down so that that surface is flush with the ground. For above ground, it would literally be putting that aggregate surface directly on the ground. No digging, no excavation. You place that surface there.
That's just what we had to do. Instead of cutting off one corner of a slope and building up, we built up to the high point. That's where we had the issue though with the FSTAG compliancy. So we had to sort of, I think, create a little more length in the trail in order to accommodate the slope change. So again, really good to know that far ahead in your project.
Yeah, you'll wind up doing a lot more retaining walls and cribbing for the surface to be the correct width.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions in the chat. Let's see here. The town of Andover received $500,000, which seems to exceed the max of 100,000, if you are familiar with what they might be referencing.
So if we're talking about this year's grant round, I don't see the question in there. Is that all that's there?
Yeah, it's in the question and answer.
Oh, it's in the question and answer. Okay.
Yeah, yep.
So just to get some, because I can't hear from the question, the town of Andover received that, which seems to exceed the max of one. So there's a max of $100,000 for recreational trails type projects, and those tend to be, Eli doesn't like it when I say this as much, but they tend to be more local in nature. They serve the more immediate population within that area, and when, on the other hand, the shared use path projects, which are funded through state funds, have a $500,000 maximum. And those tend to connect one community to another through alternative transportation means or a recreational trail that combined. And those do receive more funding because they're fully accessible shared use pathways that also serve a climate resilience and priority trail network function, which allows for us to get people out of their cars and on bikes or other means of alternative transportation on these pathway systems. So they're more expensive. They have a higher maximum than the other natural surface type trails, which you can essentially build the same amount of mileage or even much more mileage with $100,000 on a natural surface trail than you can for a shared use pathway.
Thank you. We have a question that's sort of relevant. I'll go ahead and jump to that. I noticed a lot of pictures of natural surface accessible trails. Just wondering if MassTrails funding can be used to create natural surface rail trails.
Yes. So rail trails is one of the types of trails. I mean, we fund all types of trails. We fund rail trails. They can have, we have funded the full gamut of types of trail surface on rail trails. Those can be paved. Often we have paved rail trails in our network in Massachusetts, but we also can do, you can also apply stabilized aggregate or, natural surface stone dust type materials on your rail trail. And we do fund all types of rail trail surface as long as it is accessible, because along a rail trail the expectation would be that it's firm and stable and meets at least FSTAG standards.
Good deal. Thank you. Got a bunch more questions for you. I'm just going to keep rolling. So for the Parsons Marsh project, when planning the platform and benches, picnic tables along the river, it says, did you consider flooding levels? And this year, did you find the water level rose and impacted any of your accessible trails?
We did. We went as high as we could without requiring railings. So we did not exceed 30 inches, I believe was the standard. So we stayed at between 27 and 28 inches high. That gave us a fair amount of clearance where there was open standing water. And it is a highly functioning wetland, and so there is a lot of retention area. So it has space, water does have space to move into. So I think mostly what we've seen is that areas that have more just kind of smaller pooling of water have a little bit more there. The water levels have not changed significantly enough to create an issue. It certainly is a concern. We actually had along the side of that, the first bridge picture that I showed was there because there was an issue with an earthen dam from that pond. And that was something that did really concern us, that there was essentially a blowout that had kind of a highly functioning blowout. This past summer, we addressed that, fixed the blowout, and created a naturalized area. So that is one place where we really did look to protect the resource and address what would eventually have been an overflow of a major overflow of water.
Mackenzie, I'll just
Yeah,
add to
please.
that at another accessible trail, Thomas and Palmer, that has been mentioned a couple times already. We did have an issue this summer of an adjacent just beaver activity going on that was flooding the accessible trail. So a beaver deceiver needed to be installed and some trail maintenance needed to happen after that. And it was also a really good opportunity. We had some folks upset about the installation of the beaver deceiver, but it was a really good opportunity to educate trail users about, the differing maintenance issues that you might run into, and the conflict with wildlife, of course, and beavers in particular, but the need to maintain accessibility. So it was a good opportunity to share that information. All right, so another question, FSTAG does not set out specifications for accessible benches or picnic tables. Where do we find that information?
Yeah, so that information can actually be found in the Forest Service Outdoor Recreation Accessibility Guidelines. There's a nice little pocket guide if you just Google FSORAG, FSORAG, and that pocket guide itself, you can just skim through. They've got really great dimensions, bunch of information and images to help you figure out all of the requirements.
Great, thanks, Eli. I'll be sure to find that and send it around in our follow-up email. So up in the chat, I saw some other questions come in. Susan asked, is there a scoring system the way there is for conservation partnership grants?
Let me take that, Eli. Yeah, so we do. There is against the criteria that we list in the application on our website and the guidance documents. We do have two different scoring systems, scoring rubrics for the state fund side and the recreational trails side, because the priorities are different in terms of the funding, regulatory, in terms of the legislative priorities for each of those funding sources. So we do not have those. They are not public as of yet, but we are working on the possibility of posting them at some point in time. We just haven't done that in the past, and we are going through the process of determining whether that is appropriate.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's see here. So how do I request a grant to be used in more than 1 year? Is it part of the application?
Yes, there's a budget and a timeline document. It's an Excel document that you would fill out, and you actually fill out the timeline on the second sheet to specify what kind of time frame you're looking at.
Fantastic.
I'll just
go ahead,
add
Mackenzie.
that kind of timeline analysis is so helpful in understanding your project readiness. So really carefully building all of your design development steps and within that, and I love these things in Excel, because then I also take and run out the approximate dates of the different grant programs. So if this, if I can expect that contracting will happen around the end of October, it's, maybe it's a 12/1 start date, and runs for 2 years, and I'm just making that up. I don't know for certain that's what it is. Then I'll put that into my Excel sheet. And then if I know CPA is going to come in at this date and run out, I make sure that the right steps are happening when that contract is valid. So that's can be a really, really helpful part of that process to make sure you have things, and things shift. They do shift from time to time, but at least like your main components are happening at the right time in sync with the grant.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, the review teams, the Massachusetts Recreational Trail Advisory Board reviews the grant projects that are being reviewed under the Recreational Trails Program. And likewise, Trails team, the interagency Trails team reviews the state-funded projects. And these are groups of professionals who have been building trails for years, and have a high level of expertise and experience. So we do look at your budget and your timeline, and we look to see if it makes sense and if it's feasible. And there's often, during a grant review, we might highlight a project that seems like it cannot possibly be completed within the time frame indicated. So please, again, like as Mackenzie has stated, it's very important to think through that timeline and the budget. And it's helpful in you planning out your project before you're applying as well, so that you apply for the right amount of money that you actually will need for the project, and you allow yourself the correct amount of time.
Great, thanks. I think we're one more question here. Would trail maintenance equipment or vehicles for trail maintenance qualify for funding?
I know Eli knows how to answer all of these questions too, but I never know how long I should wait. Yes, we do fund trail maintenance equipment. We have never funded an actual truck or car. That could be a lot more difficult. But please give us a call if you're, with whatever equipment thoughts you are having, and talk it through with us. And that's what I would say to everyone about any of your questions that are specific to your project. We are here, and there's 3 of us, and I would recommend calling Eli first, but I'm going to throw it over to Eli. But we are here to answer those questions and talk through your project, and especially even about your timeline and your budget. If you want somebody to bounce ideas off of, we're here. And we're really just trying to help everyone be successful with their trails project. And we want you to be successful because we love trails. That's why we do this. And we want these accessible trails also to get built out, because we know their importance to the people who need them.
Great, thank you. Looks like one other question came in from Linda, just confirming that the match is only 20%. The PowerPoint slide called Notes on Match on the MassTrails website says 20%, but the mathematical example then showed a 25% match.
Aha! That's the golden question. It's 20% of the total project value. So the way that the federal government works with its transportation funding is that you estimate the total cost of your project. If it's $100,000 to build out that trail, then you are then taking 20% out of that for your 20% match. So it's 20/80. And when you calculate that, it's not 20% of the grant funding that you are asking for, it's 20% of the total project value.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. One more question. I think we're going to have to wrap up because we're at time. Susan said you mentioned that accessible parking is important. How much is often spent on parking costs versus trail cost?
For Parsons Marsh, I was just looking at the I think that trail in particular, so that was a very expensive trail, so over $300,000 for that trail. I think that parking lot was around somewhere between 20 and 25,000. So they're not all, I would say it was probably a premium of between $5,000 and $8,000 for the accessible spaces and the accessible material, and sort of the transition from the accessible space to the spaces to the trail. Most of our, usually we budget like I'm getting tired, you can tell, depending on the situation. I think we usually budget somewhere between like 15 and just over $20,000 for a parking area. Sometimes we can bring it in lower if it's you know, it's just a simpler process, but you know, they can be rather expensive. But that's the same thing. Like, you can get a design and you can get a cost, or you can just get a cost estimate that gets you closer to project ready, and to build out your budget. So I would always get someone to try and give you a cost estimate before you're submitting this, if you're making it part of the project.
Great. Well, I think we've reached our time. Just want to say again, thank you so much to our presenters and to everybody who's attending live or watching the recording. We'll send out some helpful resources, and appreciate your time.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.